I'm very pleased to welcome Matthew Fuller and Beatrice Fazi. Matthew Fuller is Professor in the Center for Cultural Studies here at Goldsmiths, where, as Director of Creative Programs, he is involved in projects in art, media, and software with Digital Culture Unit. His published books include Media Ecologies, Materialist Energies in Art and Technoculture, published by MIT, Behind the Brick, Essays in the Culture of Software, and Elephant and Castle, both published by Media. And with Usman Haq, he is co-author of Urban Visioning System, version 1, by Omni Press, and with Andrew Godfrey of Evil Media, published by MIT. Beatrice Fazi is finishing her PhD at the Center for Cultural Studies here at Goldsmiths and is working as Associate Lecturer at the University of London. Her doctoral thesis concerns the aesthetic dimension of digital computation, exploring the centrality of abstract entities and processes to the construction of experience. Her research interests include digital aesthetics, content philosophy, computation, segmented culture, and media theory. Please join me in welcoming Matthew Fuller and Beatrice Fazi.
Okay, so thanks for braving it through the terrible storm and into the basement of this building. Hopefully the roof won't fall in. What we want to do is present a kind of some kind of formulas that may be useful in understanding the impact of computation broadly on aesthetics, but also think about these kind of phenomena as impacting more broadly on the production of subjectivities, of economic forms, social forms, and so on, out of which and in relationship to which art is made and will be made. So what we want to kind of invite you to do is to try and think, although this lecture is trying to address aesthetics in a broad sense and not necessarily specifically artwork as a subset of that field, to try and think about how a computational aesthetics allows, or understanding computational aesthetics will allow for understanding some of the kind of forces at play in the present as they manifest through the kind of wider systematization of different scales and orders of reality through the computational. So why would this be of interest in terms of the kind of formulation of art practices? One of the ways we can think of is kind of in a long duration of art history. If we think of the artist as individual emerging in the early modern period, the Renaissance period, with the emergence of capitalism, modern art, in a sense, emerges in relationship and in kind of opposition to, in many cases, the industrial, in the period of the Industrial Revolution. Conceptual art emerges from the period of the emergence of mass media and information systems. Present art, in a sense, therefore, has to react and is composed by and in relationship to the computational. So if you think of the kind of fundamental units of ordering present-day society, the computational ordering of modes of life and modes of existence is a fundamental kind of fundamental shift in the order of things which art is dealing with and has to recompose itself to. If you think of something as simple as a supermarket, it looks like, ostensibly, like a shop with a bunch of materials that you can buy, a bunch of objects you can buy, foodstuffs, pots and pans, and so on. But really, the supermarket is inherently a front end to a database. And so all the actions that are carried out in that entity, in that object, the supermarket, are in relationship to a great systematization of the order of things. So what we want to do is, in a way, present some kind of ideas and some kind of probes into that kind of situation through the question of aesthetics and how computation changes that. Obviously, these are thought experiments, not necessarily kind of programmatic declarations of the state of things, but hopefully there'll be some ideas that you can think with. So we understand computation as a method and a force of organization, quantification, and rationalization of reality by logico-mathematical means. The computational precedes yet grounds the digital in both its technical, social, and cultural manifestations. It finds in digital technologies a fast, efficient, and reliable technique of automation and distribution, yet remains a notion wider and more powerful than the digital tools that it subtends. Art, operating with the digital prefix and taking on many of the characteristics of the contemporary world, is inherently interwoven with the specific features of computational structures. At the same time, though, it can be said that aspects of digital art have not sufficiently been considered from that perspective, and to some extent this is understandable, given the immense flexibility and often resultant opacity of computational systems. Digital art builds upon and works through the computational, sharing its limits and potentials, while also inheriting conceptual histories and contexts of practice. For this reason, we contend that an aesthetics of digital art is, at a fundamental level, a computational aesthetics. So, the crux of our argument can be summarized in a particular kind of medium specificity of the aesthetics of digital art, a specificity that we see pertaining to art's primarily computational character. When making a claim for the computational specificity of digital art, however, we abstain from flattening this proposition onto openly modernist arguments or following on with sets of uneasy qualifications and rejoinders that come after such positions. So when we're talking about the medium specificity of the computational, we're wary of the essentialism that such an argument would imply. And it's our contention, however, that the risk of computational essentialism is diminished by the nature of computation itself. In the case of computational aesthetics, the idea of a kind of modernist reduction of aesthetic principles to simple understanding of matter is made more difficult because of the fundamentally abstract nature of computation as a mathematico-logical form. How is one to match the material promises of a medium if this medium does not have an idiotypic substantial form such as canvas, paint, marble or mud, but rather has to be understood as a method and as a force that through rules, constraints and capacities for expression continually renegotiates its own structures of existence. In other words, what makes computation special in terms of its mediality, and thus perhaps different from any other media coming into composition with art, is the impossibility of describing it simply as an intermediary substance. Art, thankfully enough, is not simply communications. The relation of art with its media has been complex, a relationship that is disavowed as much as it is explored, and through which one can trace the histories of many modalities of kinds of art that may themselves not cohere into a stable lineage. Art always propagates rather than necessarily progresses by disrupting and reinventing its terms of growth and domains of operation. Computation, however, has in a certain sense been a more historically delimited domain. Think of the fields of computer art, digital art, and so on. And to some extent, this is due to the relatively young state of the field as an organized discipline. At the same time, we argue computation's development through mathematics, logic, philosophy, and physical engineering give it an equally rich genealogy, so it has a kind of cultural history of its own. With its folding out into culture and the social, and indeed in its entanglement with art, computing is undergoing further mutation, and its complex lines of invention and imagination find new forms of growth. Recognizing this, critical discourse in recent years has developed cultural and artistic understandings of some of the mechanisms and components, algorithms, values, parameters, functions, codes, and so on, through which computation operates. For instance, by the emergence of fields such as software studies, And we'd like to supplement this discussion with a consideration of computation's mediality as a mechanism of ontological and epistemological production.
So, in terms of our media specificity argument, this implies that computation is a medium insofar as it actualizes modes of being, levels and kinds of agencies, and procedures of thought and configuration. The ontological and epistemological expressions of computation are concretized and become operative at various scales, the cultural, the societal, the political, as well as in art and elsewhere. Through a double articulation, computation changes these fields, yet maintains its own specificity. As specificity is in turn affected in various ways by the mutational forces of this field's characteristic. So, for us, calling for a recognition of the medium specificity of computation in digital art means to take up the challenge of considering a mediality that surpasses the bounds of its glossary material instantiation. In fact, it means acknowledging that the notion of matter itself should be remobilized through all the categories of the computational, and in light of the ontologies and epistemology the computational system initiates or participates in. Of course, a problem that immediately follows from the argument about medium specificity is how computation can be understood and spoken of, and by which means its consequence in the area of digital art can be mapped out. In attempting to address these questions, we don't advocate a programmatic aesthetics, but a way of understanding the things that are explicitly or implicitly taken into account when working with computational systems. Computational aesthetics is certainly partly entwined with the computing machine, and in many particular works, some of which we'll see, is founded on a very specific articulation of that interlacing. Yet the existence of computational aesthetics is not exclusively tied to a particular past, present, or future technology. So, I think this is an important point. Computation, we contend, is a systematization of reality via discrete means such as numbers, digits, models, procedures, measures, representations, and highly condensed formalization of relation between such things. To compute involves abstractive operation of quantification and of simulation, as well as the organization of abstract objects and procedures in their expression that can, but can also be not, be thought and perceived, or carried out. Attending to computational aesthetic, then, puts in question the forces of all degrees and kinds that participate in this abstraction, or not, and inquires what level of autonomy one should assign to such forces and abstraction. Similarly, a media-specific computational aesthetics addresses the way in which other techniques and genealogies, for instance language, science, mathematics, and art itself, conjoin, contribute to, or contrast with computation, and thus result in often irreconcilable, convulsive, or conversely reductive interrelation of other aesthetic approaches. The impact of computation on these distinct fields, to a large extent, constitute the status of the problematic of contemporary forms of life. We can all therefore conclude that computation is as much a condition as it is a medium.
Okay, so it's in light of these and related issues that the condition of computational aesthetics has to be understood not as given, but constructed. This claim, however, comes with two important qualifications. To construct is to build up, to compose, to compile. A construction requires, in varying measures, a dose of planning and an amount of improvisation. The laying of foundations and the addition of decoration, the work of an engineer and the effort of a craftsperson. In this sense, a construction is less the straightforward manufacture of a result or an output than a heterogeneous process of creation. Constructing a computational aesthetics is a similarly inventive and procedural endeavour. It is, we claim, alongside the recognition of ecology and the invention of economists, a requisite for contemporary thought imposing key issues proper to 21st century culture. For example, questions such as how to define numerically determined rules, the analysis, codification, prediction of the world, how to account for digitally interfaced modes of sensing, how to theorize new spatio-temporally distributed and network prospects for cognition. If it's a truism that computational technologies have brought about a fundamental epistemological break, constructing a computational aesthetics means to come to terms with both the disruptions and the opportunities that this break initiates in modes of perceiving, acting, and cognizing. In fact, it involves coming to terms with these conditions while looking for and articulating computational aesthetics' internal epistemological validations, those that are inherent to the theories and practices of computation itself. The construction of computational aesthetics, therefore, calls for a reworking of many of the conceptual categories, classes, types, and criteria involved in aesthetics, noting that aesthetics is in turn understood here as a theory of construction, again, of what constitutes experience. In other words, we're arguing on the one hand that to understand art in terms of the aesthetics of computation is key to the status of contemporary culture, which indeed is a computational culture. On the one hand, however, the very notion of computational aesthetics for us goes well beyond the theory of art made with computers and becomes an investigation of the more foundational and formative aspects of the reality of the computational itself. And in this respect, the reworkings of the aesthetic that we're advocating here are acts of both discovering and inventing the unfamiliar, the nameless, that which has been forgotten and is yet to be known. Computational aesthetics must and will construct its own concepts. Our first qualification of computational aesthetics mode of construction should be read in light of what we consider the restrictions or limitations of a traditional constructivist epistemology for addressing the potential for conceptual discovery and invention. So we'd like to take distance from the socio-cultural constructivist addendum, the idea that technology is simply a readout of a pre-existing political or social form. But we'd like to take the idea of construction also from an epistemological level to an ontological one, which is to say that when constructing computational aesthetics, one creates not only ways of knowing reality, but reality itself. To be more explicit, we understand the construction of computational aesthetics as a process that is internal to the notion of computation, and should therefore not be approached from any particular disciplinary ground. Computer science alone cannot fully account for the modes of existence of the aesthetics of computation, but neither can cultural theory, philosophy, or art. To say that computational aesthetics is not inferred from some particular disciplinary area, however, also means that its actuality cannot be subsumed into individual categories such as the societal, the cultural, and the economic. Computational aesthetics does not arise from a void. It is, of course, part of society, culture, and economy. And if we can for a moment accept the ruse that these things are adequately nameable, at the core of this issue lies for us the following point: to understand construction as the methodology proper for an imminent investigation of computation. We believe that the social and cultural constructivism, in wanting to accommodate and assimilate differences, reiterates instead a transcendental take on computational practices and technologies. From this transcendental perspective, human social histories or human cognitive processes are equally relative amongst each other, yet still causally superior to the events they're said to construct. We argue for another view that the construction of computational aesthetics is not solely based on the determinism of a particular identity-forging coordinate, such as time in history or as a group of people, but that this construction is in fact incidental to computation's capacity of being an imminent operation of production of its own as well as other entities' modes of existence. Computational aesthetics is not produced by the social, but it is social. Similarly, it's not the result of a certain culture, it is culture. The diversities of the planes into which computational aesthetics cuts are not the transcendent cause of the aesthetics. These planes and multiplicities of contexts, intentions, norms, actions, perceptions, etc., must themselves, to appropriate Deleuze and Guattari's claim, be made.
With this assertion that computational aesthetics must be constructed but is not given, of course, we don't mean to say that any aesthetic, we don't mean to say that aesthetic investigation of computational media is equal to anything else. We're not making here a relativist argument at all. I guess we're both quite keen to stress that. On the contrary, we affirm that the realities of computational aesthetics are produced in the expression that aesthetical computation finds for itself. So, to some extent, we could say that the construction of such aesthetics is always in the event. And we can return to that question. So, having said that, we should also note that while we are wary of simply such a cultural constructivist approach, our position also differs from what one could call an autopoietic constructivism that will frame construction as a self-producing, self-organizing operation of subjective experiencing. And here we're referring to autopoiesis in the sense of Maturana and Valera. This is then our second qualification of computational aesthetic construction, a qualification that perhaps can help us to clarify our proposal for an immanent investigation of computational aesthetics. According to the autopoietic dialectics between an observer and an observing system, everything relates to the environment insofar as it establishes and stabilizes itself in relation to it. The observer thus constructs her own world self-reflexively by positioning herself in relation to an environmental situation. We don't want, of course, to disavow the importance of such studies in certain fields, especially for cognition and theories of in standard mind, for instance. But we think that all the same, this type of constructivism, this type of, we call it autopoietic constructivism, becomes particularly problematic when applied to computational aesthetics. This is because, in our opinion, autopoietic approaches to digital art seem to overlook the fact that computation is full with encounters between levels of expressivity and actuality that cannot interact in the terms of a subject and an object, in terms of, for example, a perceiver and a perceived, and within confines of an environmental outside or inside of the system. Many of these encounters, in fact, and many of these determinations as well, concern more the human users of computation and not computation itself. We believe instead that the construction of computational aesthetics also involves incomputabilities. In computation, there are many particular cases, of course, but there is also at least an implied pretense to universality. The different speeds of eternity and fracture are often disjoint, and the diverse scales of what is too big to see, too big to count, or too small to see, are frequently beyond subjective perception. So, in this sense, the construction of a computational aesthetics needs to be radicalized from within the limits and potentiality of what computation can do and what it cannot do. So, okay, and it should not be imposed upon the experiential positioning of an observer. So we cannot add it from the outside, so as to say. In other words, what we're advocating here is the capacity of computational aesthetic not to simply represent reality, but also of constructing reality itself.
Okay, so then what we want to do is propose some different aspects of computational aesthetics, to give you some kind of roots into this. It should be stressed that we're not looking for the ultimate qualities and values of either computation or aesthetics. Rather, these characteristics, aspects, and features we take as modes of existence of the computational that infiltrate and in some cases pervade and direct its ontological and epistemological productions. In other words, these features and characteristics inform computation's modalities of being, levels of agency, and procedures of thought and experience that mark the medium specificity of art in the computational era. There is therefore no claim that the list we're proposing is either an exhaustive itemization of the conditions of computational aesthetics, or that aspects or combinations of it are exclusive to computational aesthetics and do not surface in other contexts and kinds of art or aesthetics more broadly. What we suggest instead is that computational aesthetics brings the modes that we present into a sharp focus and degree of compositional strength. So, if aesthetics can be understood very broadly as a theory of how experience is constructed, or a form of knowledge proper to that understanding, then this list attempts to account for some of the modalities of computational that partake in such constructions. The examples we offer are meant to provide an illustration of how computational aesthetics produces, regulates, but also points beyond its own ontological and epistemological validations, and thus always has to be found and investigated in the computational event. First of all, abstraction and concreteness. Computation sets in motion some fundamental reorientations of culture and of the circumstances in which art occurs, in that it endures as a conjoint condition of the abstract and the concrete. On the one hand, computation is a technique of abstraction. Layers of abstractions are piled up from the hardware and the machine language right up to the graphic user interface. They manage the in-betweens of electronic circuits and symbolic procedures, and thus safeguard the operability of computing machines. In this respect, abstraction is a self-contained dimension of existence of the computational. Historically and conceptually, computation draws upon the formal abstractions of logic and mathematics. Abstract mechanisms of inference drive it, while formal languages and symbol manipulation are among the abstract means that ground the very possibility of algorithmic effective procedures. On the other hand, however, computation is as concrete as the world in which it participates. Computation not only abstracts from the world in order to model and represent it, through such abstractions it also partakes in it. In this sense, computation is a technology of material agency. There are the actions of algorithms organizing commercial warehouses, air traffic and administrative records. There are the social associations of network practices which aggregate and shape both the technological and the cultural. There are the solid effects of software applications which intervene in and bring about modes of knowing, trading, writing, playing, perceiving, interacting, governing, and communicating. The qualities of an abstraction and concreteness have innumerable effects in terms of the constructivism and medium specificity of computational aesthetics. One of these is that the abstract structures of computation can move fast from one instantiation or occurrence to another. An algorithm can be used for sorting rice grains, faces, or patterns of pixelation, for instance. The movement across multiple sites and occasions of work is one way of tracing the variable characteristics of computational aesthetics across social forms, and to highlight some of the ways in which the computational is often built into the latter. Tracing aspects of such a genealogy, the work of Johar, which is Matsuko Yokokoji and Graham Harwood, epitomised in this installation Lungs, Slave Labour, made in 2005 with the artist collective Mongrel, or their work, a piece of code written in Perl rewriting William Blake's poem London as London PL, or the Coal-Fired Computers projects made in 2010, amongst others, works with the abstractions of relational database systems to both concretize their schema and establish relational calculus as a grammar of composition that links labour, primary accumulation, mechanisms of power, and the materialities of organic and non-organic forms of life. So to explain briefly, this installation that took place in Karlsruhe in an ex-munitions factory. During the 1940s, slave labor was used to produce the weapons, produce the armaments. Looking through the logs of this factory at the time, the archives of this factory, the artist calculated looked at how many people were there, found out their age, found out their height, found out their body weight, calculated the average number of breaths they would take during that time, and then used the relational, turned those logs into a relational database, which then pushed out using these particular kind of speakers, which are they can displace a certain quantified amount of air to breathe the same amount of air back into the space that the people who were used as slave workers in the armaments factory had breathed out during that period. So it was a kind of reenactment of the process of breathing, using the record-keeping system of the factory as its basis to kind of remobilize the control mechanism as a mechanism for reasserting memory and inhabitation of space by those who've been destroyed by it.
Our second characteristic or aspect or feature of computational aesthetic is universality. Universality in computation is established at the conceptual level of the machine, and I think it was one of the readings for today, if you got a chance to go through it, it was a reading about Alan Turing. It was indeed Alan Turing that in the 1930s pioneered the notion of computability by developing a thought experiment that puts the mental activity of computing in mechanical and finite terms in order to make a universal device, or which is subsequently known as a universal Turing machine, that will be able to replicate the behavior of any other Turing machine. So anything mechanically computable could and would be computed by such a universal device, as it would be capable to replicate, to process any algorithm fed to it. The universal Turing machine is at the basis of the von Neumann architecture for stored programmed computers, and this is the foundation of present-day computer devices, which are in fact general purpose and can be programmed to emulate each other. So in theory, this desktop computer could do what a supercomputer in a NASA lab is doing when programming a mission on Mars. Of course, it will need a lot of rewiring, it will be damn slow, but in theory, it's the same logical principle. The universal Turing machine, such function of generality is perhaps the most basic, but also the most crucial conceptual premise of modern computing technologies. Moreover, the amplification of functional operation also underpins the possibility of understanding computation as a technique of abstraction. This is already geared towards universality. If we think of abstraction as a method and a technique geared towards generalization, and this generalization in turn as a technique tending towards the universal applicability. So computation generates and disseminates abstractions that are general and inclusive. In its initiation of structures of existence, computation aims to encompass and produce both the universality of formal methods of systematization and of all-purpose methods of reasoning. So artists might respond, and indeed have responded, to this universality by attending to the specificity of particular instantiations of computational forms, as for instance, in the wave of attention that has been paid to retro computing platforms and to game ball hacks. The artist group page, for example, has looked for constraints in order to address the question of universality and thereby reveal universality nature by noting instead its particular historical concretion in styles of design, development of games, genres of games, and so on. Alternatively, The nature of claiming universality itself may be a foundational part of the exploration for certain artists, such for instance David Rockdale. This multifarious and rigorous work probe and ally with the various way in which algorithms and other procedural and interpretative acts of computers shape and condense as spaces and as behaviors.
Okay, so here, Rockaby's work is it's kind of a very foundational piece of work that's been developed over many years, looking at the way in which, using very basic sensors, interactions with the space can produce a new, novel experience of space. What he argues is that sensors push algorithms out of the computer into space and change the way we behave around it. So something is described. The other kind of quality we want to talk about, or another one, is discreteness. The idea of things being discrete. Something is defined as discrete if it's disjointed, separated, distinct, detached, or discontinuous. Discreteness is arguably the hallmark of the digital. Digital systems, by definition, are discrete systems. They represent, store, and transfer information in terms of discontinuous elements or values, binary digits, for example, or letters of the alphabet. The computational, as we explained above, is not synonymous with the digital. The digital should be understood as an automation of the computational. Computation itself, however, is also marked by discreteness. As a rule-governed activity, computation arranges calculation procedures through the sequential succession of countable and separable states. The valid reasoning that computational mechanisms are meant to encapsulate and model is explicated by the manipulation of quantifiable entities into a finite sequence of well-defined steps. The time and memory that such a sequence employs in order to perform the computation are also finite. So too are the input that sets it in motion and the outcome that it generates. The discreteness of computation is often at odds with the continuity of interactions proposed by effective philosophers, systems theorists, and cognitive phenomenologists, which in art, culture, and science focus on the dynamic becoming of relations and connections. Discreteness prompts questions about the recognition one is willing to give to computational entities on the one side and computational processes on the other, and invites further investigation of whether a theoretical and technical reconciliation between the two is possible. The discreteness of a computational object may also be used for comedic effect, as in the game Surgeon Simulator, where a patient, body parts, surgical tools, transplant organs, and the paraphernalia of an operating theatre are all to be worked on by interacting with a first-person shooter-style interface. The game is a device-based grand guignol that reaches the levels of slapstick and the clashing, clumsy interactions of the handled object's level of discreteness. Discreteness also allows for the recomposition of things in their fixture in new positions, thereby generating both new kinds of commodity form and new commonalities. This potential is illustrated, for instance, by Yuri Patterson's e-ink Earl Memory of last year, in which discreteness is employed as a means of disrupting the transcendental role of the commodity and of instituting various forms of sharing or creating a commons. We think of the work of Arcadia Misser as a gallery project to try and work through some of these kind of issues. But also the latter aim of creating a commons is a prominent aspect of numerous computational initiatives, but becomes most obvious in free software and ventures such as Pirate Bay, as different levels of discretion, alongside the ability of copying wholes or parts, combined with computing resources such as memory or bandwidth, discreteness plays a part in the development of expressive styles and modes of computing at multiple scales, including the determination of degrees of granularity and the resolution of images, for instance. Discretion, the ability to keep things separate, is by necessity a key factor of the ethico-aesthetic dimensions of computational technology's political nature, determining what they reveal, what they make tractable, as well as what they hide. The regimes of what links can be analysed, what pulls together, and what remains apart are core to the nature of this shift.
This is a very clear takeaway to me. Computation, we should say, is axiomatic. I probably should add a full stop here. We add in the text, in fact. The modes of abstraction, universality and discreteness that we have just looked at are key features of this axiomatic character of computational systems and of the many parallels between computation and logical mathematical reasoning. By this axiomatic character, these parallels distinguish past and present conception. The machines are taking over. Well, we can discuss this as an example of axiomatic rationality later. In this axiomatic character, this parallel distinguish past and present conception of digital computing machines. So, as it's well known, Alan Turing, him again, established the notion of computability after having discovered a particular class of numbers that cannot indeed be computed, the incomputable numbers. Turing demonstrated, however, and this was his genius, that what is computable can be determined algorithmically, that is, through a mechanized principle of deductive inference, or as mathematician Gregory Childing likes to say, with every tiny step of reasoning in place. So, what has been up to then an informal notion of computation, one hence formalized into an axiomatic parameters of logical mathematical reasoning, of correct inference. In this sense, to compute became to manage discrete quantities, and to do so by following abstract and finite inferential rules with universal applicability. Today, the axiomatic nature of computing subsists in and thrives on its many formalisms. The axiomatic method is central to symbolic notation and procedural execution for any calculating processes, whether a basic operation or a more complicated function. The computational system engages and then engages again and again and again, it repeats in a sort of iteration, with the general problem of determining consequences from a handful of valid symbolized premises. So for us, it's because the inevitability of axiomatic in computation, the digital art and the digital artists and digital theorists cannot leave the formalization of computation to the computer scientists. Instead, what we argue is that we need to take up the challenge of thinking and creating an aesthetic of computation that takes into account, if not limiting itself to, the inferential and rule-based character of computational system, while also remaining aware of the ways in which computation borrows methods from mathematics and logic.
Okay, so slide 17 in numbers. Computation holds a multifaceted and profound relationship to numbers. Of course, contemporary computers are what Leibniz calls metamedia, capable of accomplishing much more than merely crunching numbers. However, the computing machine's relation to the numerical remains intimate. This is due partly to computation's discrete and quantitative nature, and partly to the fact that a computing machine has to operate within the parameters of a calculation. The very idea of number has continuously changed over time, stretching and convoluting to encompass new categories and attributes, and has become something different again in its encounter with the medium specificity of computation, a means of establishing relations among abstractive methods, formal systems and concrete tasks that are governed in turn by the operation of numbers. Although this recursion to some degree existed before in techniques such as the calculus, it's fundamentally different in computation in terms of the quantity and density of operations. Numbers in computation show various qualities and behaviors. As a unit of measurement, numbers are used, for instance, to portion pixels, megahertz, and registers in memory. As a mathematical entity, numbers are the objects of the many types of counting that computers carry out, counting of amounts, of sequential steps, of variables, of inputs, of time, and so on. As an incommensurable quantity, numbers approximate the risk of infinite loops within recursive functions. As a digital representation, they mirror electronic binary states into binary digits. As a symbol, numbers are elements of codes and scripts and cement the possibility of encryption, while also being means of organizing, prioritizing, and enacting such qualities and behaviors.
Limits. Computation is limited in a quite fundamental way. These limitations are intrinsic in the axiomatic nature of the computational system. So in mathematical logic, they talk about decidable proposition. In computability theory instead, there exists problems that cannot be solved by purely mechanical procedures. The formal notion of computation itself is founded upon the discovery that some programs will not halt, that some function will not be calculated. Some things, and we know that from experience, just cannot be computed. The existence of limits in computation is unsettling, but we believe it's also very empowering. Amongst the most troubling consequences of this limitation is the comprehension and the understanding that while computer machines do indeed process many things and many tasks, they do not process just anything. So this means that technocultural agendas proposing an all-embracing and all-solving rationality, algorithmic rationality, as was faulty at the very outset. Error, bugs, glitches may be more or less probable, depending on the specific case. Yet they are always logically possible, as it's a formalist misapprehension of a situation or a condition. One of the most interesting outcomes of the limits of computation, however, results from turning, this is the, could be considered an internal failure, into the very method through which computation operates. And this is also, in my opinion, what makes computation very interesting, the fact that historically, conceptually, but also practically, the discipline was founded not by discovering what computers can do, but by discovering what they cannot do. It's a sort of paradoxical foundation of the discipline itself. And limitation, just like the previously discussed principle of universality, are established at the conceptual level of the computing machine, in the sense that when the computing machine is formalized, it's realized there are intrinsic limits to it. Given the necessary provisions, however, the formal reduction of computational systems have been turned into a system of unprecedented instrumental power. To the cultural theorist, the philosopher, and one of the artists, such mismatches, ambiguities surrounding promises of delivery and potentials for machine breakdown or misrecognition, often equally finely textured occasion for speculation, and are also one of the qualities of computation guard in the exercise of power. So I guess for us, the incomputable is not really, it is a challenge, and we need to think and work and theorize confronting this challenge, but this challenge, not despite this challenge, but exactly in virtue of this challenge, I would say.
Okay, so the next aspect we want to talk about is speeds. So are stages different relations to time? For instance, in the way a dance slows, speeds, accentuates, draws attention to the minuscule or raises it to the level of the cosmic. A relationship to modulation and creation of time and of timings characterizes a work and articulates its mode of being in the world. Computational aesthetics enters into relations with such articulation by intervening in time in certain ways. The intensity of computational speed is characteristically emphasized as being core to its novelty and its world-making capacities. While the audience is supposed to pay attention to a rapidly unfolding of a complex process in computer graphics saturated machines, the scenes are often rendered to film in great slowness, as if to suggest that in order to yield something comprehensible to the human sensorium, what passes in less than a moment in computational terms must necessarily be drawn out over minutes. Computational speed is thus about experiential intensity as much as it is about strict measure. Yet it's also about the mobile threshold and the capacities of computing itself and structuring its own modes of existence. The speed of calculation of a computer was from the very outset in monstrous disproportion to the capacities of humans, just as machine weaving had been to the movements of earlier generations of hand weavers. This scale of disproportion is fluid, and forms a complex set of texturing or expression that manifests in anything from interaction times and musical instrumentation to meteorarchaeological concerns regarding speed of execution or bandwidth in the conservation of aesthetic objects. This issue connects to the subsequent characteristic of speed within computational aesthetics, namely its constructivist nature. As a consequence of the universal Turing machine, the timing of many kinds of processes can be brought about within the machine. Computing has no inherent native speed, but provides means of staking out and arranging relations to speeds. While intensification of speed is one mode at which computational expression is staged, extension of a work over time is also a significant tendency, especially in works such as Jem Finer's long play, which you can see a version of here, but also Gustav Metzger's 1965 proposed 5 screens with computer, where the unfolding of a work is in relationship to monumental time. This was an auto-destructive work which would gradually decompose over a period of centuries.
Scale effects are core to the development of computing in the present era. By scale effects, we mean that the ways in which a specific kind of structure or process can be instantiated both across a relatively small number of instances and for a tendentially infinite quantity of them. Systems designed to navigate and conjoin multiple scales, such for instance the Golden ratio or Corpuscular modular from 1954, exist within numerous aesthetic forms as a means of arranging elements or making and assisting a judgment about this form's efficacy of beauty. Computing, however, allows for this system of judgment and composition to be integrated into the technology in which these systems themselves are realized. In systems such as the World Wide Web, limitation of scale due to material consideration tends toward the negligible, resulting in the use of the term scale-free to describe the web's pattern of network growth. The specific quality of scale-free nature of such a system contrasts with other aspects of computational aesthetics. This is due to the quality of universality systems such as finite state machines, which have a very small scale that can coexist alongside systems of larger scale. Most notably, however, there may be transition across the scales. A multitude of small-scale finite state machines, for instance, can be conjoined in order to generate a system of great complexity that can be described as scale-free. This is something that is done, for instance, to account for problems such as computational resources such as time, speed, for instance, in sciences for procedures that are quite complicated, like the folding of a protein to simulate that. And nature does it in seconds, but to simulate that with our contemporary computers, it will take hundreds and hundreds of years. So the scale of smaller finite systems are connected together to create a massive parallel computation. So computational aesthetics include, as this core constituent, the movement in and out of scales of reference. Concomitantly, the tendency towards a scale-free aesthetic in certain works operating on the basis of these networks can be observed and is to be expected even much so in the future. The scale-free nature of certain computing forms is coupled in dynamic ways with currents such as globalization, which was explored in the early internet art presented by Shuli Chen in Nomad's projects such as Buy One Get One from 1997. You can look at that URL. Artists such as Ai Weiwei have used this condition in creating a global constituents for their work in a period in which the artist, perhaps this is due also to the demise and reputation of other figures such as the politician or the banker, the artist becomes a potential candidate for the role of moral hero. Other artists in groups such as the Yes Man, Udo Morger, or Paolo Cirio have used the unstable conditions implied by the scale-free networks, in specific case World Wide Web networks, and globalization as the partial point for exploring such a technical expressions of networked forms, as they mesh various political and institutional configurations. The question of scales, however, is also linked to development of platforms for cultural expression, since the potentially scale-free nature of a project in technical respects aligns with the capacity of expression of specific social and cultural forces and individual histories embedded in them. The development of platforms such as the video analysis and combination side partner that you see here on the background, been around since 2008, and it is run by a coalition of groups based in Mumbai. Or other example could be the picture sharing platform 9 from Mongrel in 2003, or the text discussion site art.org. So these sites, in their combination of invention, specificity, their amalgamation with other groups, history, and resources, exemplify such condition of moving in and out scales and scale-free networks.
Okay, one of the last kind of aspects we want to draw out is the idea of logical equivalence. So in earlier discussions of digital media, much attention was paid to the question of whether or not a particular experience or living thing or thing qualified as real or virtual. Recognizing the medium specificity and the constructivism inherent in computational aesthetics suggests that it might be more fruitful to pay attention to the discussion of forms of logical equivalence. A system can be said to be logically equivalent to another if it yields the same behaviors and functions, independent of each system's underlying material structure. Logical equivalence is a quality that's foundational to computing as a thought experiment, arising out of the need to equate computing activity with the mental processes of a person. Alan Turing describes the procedure of making a calculation as a series of mental processes and note-making, abstracting the procedure to a formally describable set of steps that can then be instantiated in a machine. The result is an axiomatic procedure that can be universally applied to any computable problem. The a priori limits of the axiomatic procedure itself remain, however, as yet intractable. Simulation is one effect of establishing logical equivalence between systems. An entity or process may be ordered in such a way that it is rendered more or less behaviorally identical to that which it models. At the same time, there may be play within the kinds of equivalence that are operative. At a certain scale, for example, a system may display logical equivalence to another, yet be composed of substantially different materials. There may also be interplay within the subjective experience of each different instantiation of a logically equivalent event or performance. The musicological concept of interpretation may be pertinent here. The translation of behaviors and entities from other contexts into computational ones implies an evaluation of what constitutes meaningful forms of equivalence, and thereby the intensification of the aesthetic along with ethical judgment. The interplay of these conditions has proven to be a very active conjunction for many artists. In his ongoing Status project from 2005 onwards, for instance, Heath Bunting sets out to establish a logically equivalent description for the process of attaining membership in various kinds of social formation, such as nation states or video libraries. By following certain set and defined procedures, one may acquire a position that can be computed as verifiable within a logically describable system of veridiction, a statement that is true according to the worldview of a particular subject. The condition of logical equivalence has also driven much work in the field of bioart, where the reduction of the characteristics of DNA to its base pairs, thymine, cytosine, adenine, and guanine, allows for the rearticulation and the handling of the amino acids that they signify and partially render tractable.
Okay. Our last category or aspect or feature of computation is memory. Within computing, the fact that both data and the structure, the act of that data, are themselves stored as data has significant consequences. Not the least of these consequences is that, since a computational machine can be completely copied with great ease under condition of logical equivalence, the condition for an effective digital commons can be produced. The fact about a computer and the data that runs on it, including the imperative and executable data software, can be copied, creates interesting situations in politics and economics, situations that also have consequences for art and contribute to the social and economic forces of computing at large. Memory also introduces other conditions and forms of computational aesthetics. Possibility for both all action and interaction to be logged in order to be restaged or analyzed, and within different configuration, for the partial or full reversibility or irreversibility of an action. Moreover, memory presents condition of delay and storage, so that an event might unfold in computational time at a different moment. Related to the question of speed, time, as it manifests itself in the relation between processing and storage and in interaction between a computational system and a subject, such as a musician, a dancer, or a game player, time becomes a crucial factor in the development of the aesthetic modality of both specific system and computational system as a whole. Memory, understood as the extent of the capacity to process data, also has significant effects for digital art. These effects are readily observable in 8-bit aesthetics, and was brilliantly described by Olga Guranova, or where constrained data architecture are adapted or simulated for the pleasure of the nostalgic or simplified form. However, it can also be seen in the use of any constrained computing system, that is to say, any at all. We could also argue the memory exemplified in an interplay between learning and the relentless lack of it, in computing and elsewhere. Christopher Quintera, Human Scale Robot Revolution from 2005, did his hooded head handles it over and over and over against the wall. This is, however, not a generative error, as for instance glitch would be, but a machinic ability to repeat without recourse to reflection. This is very interesting insofar as with computing there's a lot of decision making, but without really a reflection of criticality of the decision. A decision is taken by the computer, but there's no, what we could say, a reflection. I mean, there's no learning as such. Machine learning is today one of the most difficult enterprises in computer science.
Okay, so just to wrap up. So clearly, from this list of kind of 10 aspects of computing, you could probably, of computational aesthetics, you could probably add some more of your own. Our aim is not to be complete. Indeed, part of the question of the aesthetics of contemporary digital media, particularly as they're developed by artists, is to advance and proliferate frameworks for recognizing further modes for the computational. And the task of so doing is a collective one, and one cannot be reduced to a schematic list of qualities or to a set of conditions imported into art directly from an understanding of different forms of computer science. Once again, we'd like to stress that computational aesthetics and the imminent investigation of it reside in the computational event. Computing and its aesthetics are no longer owned by the disciplines and fields that grew up closely in and around it. The computational mundane of everyday objects and processes, such as that we've all got in our probably got in our pockets or purses, as well as the more arrogant, and more explicitly critical and speculative modes of computational forms, may be interrogated by means of characteristics that we've discussed in the last hour or so. At the same time, the nature of the computational may be changed by bringing more conditions and forms of existence into its purview. All of this together, along with the very flexibility of computational realities, means that these considerations can only ever be a provisional and partial mapping. There is much to invent and to be dazzled by, much texture to be found. One might discover a strange, dull, as yet unnameable familiarity to certain repetitions and compulsions that may indeed travel unremarked from art installations to office work and to social forms. To go beyond such a list needs to engage in a preliminary process of recognizing and operating the aesthetic dimensions of computation. As critical experimental work moves more substantially in this direction, the force and method of computation may become more open to understanding, discovery, and invention. Okay, thanks for your patience. Okay, thanks. So we're open for any questions or discussion or whatever you will.
Some of the work we've shown concedes that there's less of an analogy between these traditional categories of computational aesthetics. And I wonder whether the extent to which computers are often engaged in producing simulacra of things in the world, let's say 3D modeling perhaps, or generating music. Is that a betrayal of some of these categories you put out there, or do you see it as an extension of these criteria? Is it in that sense a concession to? I know you said these categories are shared, but not necessarily not between computational aesthetics.
I think it's a complex question. In one sense, there was a kind of earlier version of this debate in the 90s, where there was the kind of the real versus virtual reality argument, which kind of followed on through Baudrillard's discussion of the simulacra and so on. And that's in a way what we're trying to do is to try and think what comes after that debate when computation is not systematically viewed, it's not a novel phenomenon, but it's something that's kind of woven into everyday life, woven into politics, woven into social formations, and in a sense is the place of the everyday. So it's no longer something that just simulates what happens, but it's something that is just instantiates and is woven into what happens. At the same time, I think you could say that with certain forms of modeling, with certain forms of simulation, there are other possibilities for novel forms of aesthetics to arise, novel forms of knowledge, novel forms of engagement with the world. You can look at game theory on one hand, or kind of weather prediction as ways in which this occurs. So that the weather predictions runs on a simulation of the world's weather or specific locations, weather, and produces the experience and knowledge of the probabilistic understanding of weather as it's due to occur. So in that sense, kind of simulation enters into and also enacts with our experience of the world.
Yes, because to some extent we do make a very realist argument. So for us, computation task is real. It's not a simulation. If the artificial is not a simulation of the natural, it is a natural in its own way, let's say. So what is interesting for us in addressing computation aesthetically means to see how computation can changes and transforms, but also get entangled with categories such as experience and abstractions. Their course are fundamental to art, but fundamental to any investigation into reality. So computational aesthetics, of course, has a lot to do with the art made with computers, but it's more an investigation. Yes, I'm speaking to me now. It's more an investigation of how this category of abstraction and experience gets turned upside down by this structuring of the world that computation offers. So in that sense, yeah, I guess we're moving from a simulation debate. We're making a quite realist argument. Things that exist when they are real.
I have a question concerning this notion of scale and scale free. It's more, I was thinking, isn't it a bit, because at the end, internet is maybe in itself, or like computational, maybe scale free, but it's really tied to energy and data center and all these things. So it's not really scale free. It's like, it's really a lot of like scale together that are like connected. That you have the feeling that it's scale free, but it's not really scale free, right? In that sense.
Yeah, that's a very good point, in the sense that when we're talking about such systems, they're inherently tied up with ecologies of other forms, such as natural resources and so on. In this case, the term scale-free means kind of mathematically scale-free. So there's no inherent, so this thing we showed, Padma, which is a video database, it's been produced by a group from Mumbai, but also working with Serpentine Centre for Possible Studies to produce a video archive form. And the project is scale-free in the sense that there's no inherent limit to it. So the same system can hold 10 videos, or it can hold 10 million. In the same way that forms of governance now are scale-free in many senses. So the register that everyone supposedly has to sign when you enter the room can encompass all the students in the institution, or it can encompass just the people in the class. So it's that sense of scale-free. So the table and row form of the register is a scale-free form. One you should resist, however. It will mean if you keep signing it and keep kind of obeying that system, it will mean your fellow students will be interrogated not simply as scale-free entities within a scale-free system, but things that can be removed from the country for simple violation of bureaucratic protocol. So I do think about these systems as very active in this space. Okay, sorry, there's one there and one there.
In terms of art specifically, recently there's been quite an aesthetic preoccupation with outmoded technology within sort of like things like graphics, for example, like things that are digital which are already outmoded. It's like the idea of retro being now something that's gone into the digital world. How do you see that idea of things that are no longer the most recent technology that's available coming into these ideas? Because obviously that's almost like a further abstraction, because we can look back with other technologies that's available which looks different and see that sort of time having passed.
No, I think it's a very complex. It's a very complex question. I mean, Richard Hamilton, for instance, made some computer-based work with very outmoded computers, one of which is held by the tape. They can't even afford to switch it on because they don't know whether it will break as soon as they put electric current through it. So this kind of sense of outmodedness, the time he made it, it was actually very up-to-date mini computer, BDP-10. At the same time, this kind of, we showed Paul's work from Beige, which does address, outmoded technology, the Nintendo Game Boy, which at one time was, absolutely the kind of the cutting edge of the invasion of computation into the kind of everyday sensorium. So this kind of way in which I think art has been relatively slow in certain cases in addressing the kind of impact or registering the impact of computation. But at the same time, there's also been very fast and very kind of sensitive to the way in which specific aesthetic forms really kind of epitomized in particular kind of modes of restructuring reality. So for instance, in this work, there is a kind of great sensitivity to texture, to speed, to the way in which the machine itself is a kind of, it kind of participates in vision, in sensing, in prehension, and also has its own kind of specific aesthetic texture, which is something to be worked through. And in a way, the retro aspect is partly because it's at the moment when things are just like, you know, a kind of Hegelian move, where you say you only recognize something at that point it's already over, you know. And I think that by bringing these things into the present, there's a way in which that kind of more general condition of being over can be recognized. So I think it's, but I think this is probably another. There's a stage in which kind of the generalization of computation now has to be addressed by artists, I think, and is being done so. Okay, there's a question there. Sorry.
Yeah, something passed me by a bit there, which was your use of the word transcendental. Go back to that and tell me exactly what you meant by that in relation to this theory.
I guess it was in relation to computational construction, when we say that the static investigation of computation for us has to be immanent, and for that we meant that has to take place within the computational event itself. It means that we were making an argument there against, I guess, social constructivism. And social constructivism, not the field in total, but more, generally tends to look at situations, how situations are constructed. But for us, it tends to do so by imposing an outside look, so an outside principle upon it, whether it would be like the history or a certain class determination and so on. So there's somehow the causes of a certain situation are determined from the outside. While for us, computational aesthetics has to be immanent in the sense that it's sort of causes of itself. Yes, we could explain it like that. It cannot be imposed from an outside discipline. Okay, art can give us measures and ways of addressing the aesthetics of computation, and computer science gives other way, and cultural theory and philosophy gives other way. But at the end, the analysis of what is aesthetics for computation comes from the study of computational things, computational events. So there's always been somehow, we cannot impose an outside look, an outside causation, but has to come from within the practice itself. And I'm using practice in a quite loose sense because I don't want to make a distinction between theory and practice. And transcendental, it transcended in that respect. It could be referred to a specific type of explanation of how things come about, and when they are imposed from when the cause of something is external to the thing itself. It's a term that's used a lot in theology, in philosophy, to express the fact that the order, the reason, the meaning, the finality of something is determined by something else. Does it explain? Am I making more complicated than it was originally?
In many sense, doesn't computer considered as another tool that added to other things? It's not just we can see the computer as a abstract just on itself. It's just another tool that imply other things that was developed through the history, through technology in the past. And it's just another tool that added to other things, like the term of the supermarket is that instead of the paper and sign and other things, it just became another extra tool, not just an independent mechanism that includes everything or maybe.
Well, I guess it depends. it goes back to what you consider technology, whether a tool or a way of creating different types of reality. So technology, of course, is in a Hegelian sense, is very much a tool. But computation, at least for me, is not just a technology, it is a way of structuring things. So it's a method of structuring reality to quantities, to steps, to discreteness, to a sequence of inference and procedure. To that extent, for me, it goes beyond simply a tool. It becomes more, I think of computation as a structure. So whether this is like the structure of structuralism or the structure of post-structuralism, I don't know. This is something that I want to investigate in the future. If we can bring this idea of structure, of form. Maybe to an art audience, I should talk of computation in terms of form. For me, computation is a form more than a tool. And undoubtedly has been used as a tool. But I guess part of the aim of this paper was to see it could be used, computation could become formative of art in the sense of giving new ways of addressing structural means and things like that.
I mean, the kind of question of the tool in the kind of culture of technology or the kind of philosophy of technology is an old problem in a sense. And it's in a sense about the kind of, is the tool simply an extension of the person, you know, some kind of McLuhan, Heidegger, etc., or is it something that completely changes the nature of the human, or is it something that's inherent to, you know, this is the originary technicity argument, that is inherent to the genesis of the human itself. You know, so people like Leroy Mohan or Bernard Stiegler would make this kind of argument that the evolution of the human is inherently caught up with tools, technologies, language, which means you can't distinguish it and turn it into something that is simply an extension of man, in McLuhan's terms. I think our argument is more fundamental than that, in a sense that this creates a new condition, that it's not simply about, you know, kind of the old kind of ink and paper ledgers. It's also that the record, if we take the example of the supermarket, gets turned into a more fundamentally complex machine, which, coupled with things like globalization and others, produces a new condition. You know, you can look at, say, Haroon Faraki's films about supermarkets as kind of example of the way in which the whole supermarket becomes a computational environment, working out which products people want to buy, where to place things, what kinds of lines of sight to array things in, and so on, in order to generate the most kind of throughput, the most activation of purchasing decisions, and so on.
But the same levels, it's like a bigger machine, just that's it. And that's like capitalism also just development became a bigger machine over the world, and that might be just if there was another alternative with this expansion of the capitalism and the market and everything, then there was another alternative of that in another way. But then it's like the market is becoming bigger, is another type of.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to some extent, but then I think it's important not to conflate computing with capitalism.
There's a kind of everything like if we take a look inside the programs that produce for photography or video that take the techniques from the other media and then develop into simulate the other media. And then
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting in that case. So this Photoshop, for instance, would be the example, you know, of what's called a skeuomorph, of taking the metaphor of the darkroom and applying it to digital image manipulation. However, if you go through, if you look, there's a paper by Ladmanovich published in issue 1 of Computational Culture, which is a journal concerned with this area of cultural theory meeting computing. He goes through that application and kind of shows how that doesn't work anymore. It doesn't hold. So the metaphor doesn't doesn't predetermine, the metaphor of the darkroom doesn't predetermine how images are made now. So if we're constantly looking for this kind of reassuring reassuring kind of return to some originally metaphoric state of the physical kind of discrete, knowable, mid-sized objects, then we're missing actually what's happening in terms of how computation is producing new grammars and new forms of relation between different kinds of entities. And so I think it's a very good point you're making, but it kind of ultimately obscures the real change that's happening.
Sorry. Hi. So I think that, if I grasp some of this correctly, that a lot of your project is about a kind of a realism without, you call yourself realist, a realism without representation. So you're looking at computational aesthetics from this perspective of producing a kind of realism that isn't just representation or is outside of that. But I wonder about the choice of, and this is a very common thing that I wonder when people from other disciplines talk about contemporary art, about whether some of the choice of what you're showing us actually is almost pure representation. Like I think about the thing hitting its head on the wall and how that's almost like a pure metaphor, that's a kind of about. Whereas surely with computational aesthetics, you would want to be able to take that aboutness out. And you know, the ideas of scale and a lot of the things that you've talked about seems to be proposing an aesthetic model in which aboutness is something that we might want to avoid, or representation. So I'm just wondering about how you might kind of think through other kinds of practices. Some maybe more contemporary post-internet practices. I don't like that. That's a difficult term to bring in, but practices that kind of self-replicating, that do what they're saying. So I'm just wondering in terms of, or even for me, if I think about a writing practice in these terms, it might be a more appropriate way. I'm just kind of worried about using art in a way that is an image of what you're talking about, which is kind of ethically an antithesis to what you're talking about or you're proposing as an aesthetics. Does that make sense? So kind of like, how do these images that you choose fit into the model that you're talking about, or do they not really? Are they actually maybe representations instead of just, yeah, I guess.
I mean, again, a good question, I think Christophe Quintera's Revolution is a robot that smashes its head against the wall. Yeah. It has no memory of that process, and you can compare it to, I don't know, Chris Burden's Goliath sculpture, which gradually kind of knocks down the early art institutions part of it, except this is a robot that destroys itself, effectively. I think within the works we've looked at, there is to a certain extent a representational aspect, but it's not a representation that fits our criteria, in a sense that, you know, for instance, if you look at London.pl by Harvard, it's really about using, it's a functional piece of code that can be run. It's written in the language Perl, that is also something that mixes that mode of language with the form of Blake's poem, and also the way in which that was then printed as a broadsheet or as pages within books of poetry. So it's something that works across these different levels, some of which can be interpreted as representation, but they can also be interpreted as material entities in themselves. So I think there's a way in which we're trying to draw attention to non-representational aspects, but at the same time say, A, that the representational can be mobilized in this relation, and that I think there's a way in which a strong claim for the non-representational aesthetics would also work on and allow us to kind of revisit modes of art, modes of figuration that are by and large traditionally thought in representational terms. So I think this is also part of what we're thinking about, is the way in which the kind of non-representational aspect of computation, which relies itself on forms of representation such as code, such as the binaries, such as symbolic systems, also has kind of material dimensions to them. There's a kind of long history of cultural theory or philosophy looking at that aspect. I mean, we can look at Bakhtin's writing on language, for instance, as a way of thinking about language as material. So I think there's ways in which I think your argument is a correct one to ask, but I mean your question is a correct one to ask. But in a way, the kind of shift to the non-representational, in a sense, means that the kind of artworks we're looking at are not really about representation of these phenomena, but embodiment of them in certain ways. And it's these particular ways in which artworks tease out relationships to these dynamics and these cultural currents that we're specifically interested in.
How do you feel about esoteric programming languages? I mean, I'm just thinking, is this kind of like that's quite maybe a good metaphor of something that takes pleasure in a representation that also does something that is completely unreadable, though, if you can, it works on maybe levels of visibility that are quite interesting.
Yeah. So esoteric programming languages would be something like mindfuck, or brainfuck, or malbolge, or whitespace. Whitespace is a programming language that only uses the empty set in the characters available on the keyboard. So the space, tab, stuff like this, as a way of producing piece of code. Certainly, it's fantastic. Yeah, very interesting as a way of. And if you look on GitHub, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, it's a code repository. You can find the source for these languages and pieces of code written within them. So it's GitHub, GITHUB. You can find online. But yeah, a number of artists are working with those obscure or esoteric or weird programming languages. Okay.
I was just wondering what relationship there was between maybe your idea of computational aesthetics and maybe networked aesthetics, because it struck me that a lot of the examples that you showed actually could have been made almost in a pre-networked era, just with computers. So, like the Blake in turn, or the surgeon one, Boston Studios one. There's certain things, even the robot, they seem to speak more of computational processes like limits, like scalability, rather than a kind of network paradigm. So I was just interested in how those two connected.
Yeah, that's definitely an overlap, but I guess possibly the way to answer your question is that we say that somebody in the paper that computation is instantiated in the computing machine, and it's how it gained much popularity and much efficacy. But it's, as a technique, it's something that goes well beyond and comes from other types of histories, in the sense that it's not only tied to the computing machine, computation, like some will argue in the biology that ants compute, or like the motor of the sky, the stars will, in the movement, will produce a form of computation, or again types of calculation like the abacus, or other ancient systems who are still forms of computing. So in the sense that they offer a procedure to solve a problem through discrete means, discrete steps. So in a sense, yes, these works, the principles of these works could be addressed also without computers, in a sense that computational aesthetic is a aesthetic of procedures, of interconnections, of discreteness. They always have to face the problem of continuity, though. The fact that we experience this thing as continuous manifestation, continuous experiences are indeed based on procedures. They are very discrete. So I wouldn't say that computational aesthetics, we want to talk about digital computational aesthetics because that's the world we're living in, but it could be made an argument could be made that computational aesthetics is not something of from 1956 on, from when like the principle of the computer were laid out in the mathematical paper from Turing, but it's something that can be found also like in other types of procedures, like people have talked about urbanist fractals. There's a really lovely book, African Fractals, of how these urbanism in African villages will, the constitution of these towns and villages will express forms of computation in their arrangements and their procedures. So, yeah, definitely, I wouldn't say that computational aesthetic is aesthetics of the computing machine. The aesthetics could be an aesthetic of networks, could be an aesthetic of concept. There's a lot of interact with conceptual art in that sense. So,
yeah, I mean, those specifically network aesthetics, like mail art, for instance.
yeah.
You know, some of these have been outside of computers, but there's a lot of ways in which there's a very algorithmic level to mail art. If you think of kind of Ray Johnson or Rice Cohen's work, which are very much kind of instruction based. These kind of algorithmic processes, which at the same time are not strictly computational.
On that algorithmic computation.
Well, thank you very much for a really cooperative talk. It's really extended the boundaries of our lectures. It's great that we could do it. And invitation as usual, to the Marcus of Granted. Thank you.